If I told you that China just moved $2 trillion in a single day without touching the Western banking system, you'd probably ask how that's even possible. It happened. And most Americans have no idea it even occurred. On a Tuesday in late 2024, China's digital yuan processed over $2 trillion in transactions. Not through SWIFT, not through Visa or MasterCard, not through any American financial infrastructure, through a system Beijing controls completely, a system with an off switch that only China can flip. The number itself is staggering. $2 trillion, that's roughly the entire annual GDP of Italy, moved in 24 hours through a currency that didn't exist 5 years ago. But the number isn't the story. The story is what that number represents. The end of a monopoly that has defined global power for 8 decades. The dollar has been the world's reserve currency since 1944. Every major trade settlement, every oil transaction, every significant international payment has flowed through dollar-denominated channels. This wasn't just convenience, it was control. When you control the currency the world uses, you control the leverage. Sanctions become weapons. Financial access becomes permission. And America has wielded that permission with precision. Until now, the digital yuan is not a cryptocurrency. It's not decentralized. It's not private. It's the opposite of everything Bitcoin promised. It's a central bank digital currency, issued and monitored by the People's Bank of China. Every transaction is visible, every wallet is traceable, every user is known, and that's exactly why it works. China didn't build this system for freedom, they built it for control. But not just control over their own citizens. Control over an alternative financial architecture that doesn't need Western approval to function. When China launched the digital yuan pilot program in 2020, Western analysts dismissed it. They called it a surveillance tool, a domestic experiment, something that would never scale internationally. They were wrong on every count. The digital yuan is now active in over 50 countries. It's used in trade settlements with Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Argentina. Nations that have grown tired of asking permission from Washington to conduct their own commerce. Nations that have watched as the U.S. froze assets, cut off SWIFT access, and weaponized the financial system to enforce foreign policy. The $2 trillion day wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a stress test. Beijing wanted to prove the system could handle volume, real volume, the kind of volume that comes from actual trade, actual payments, actual economic activity. And it worked without a single failure. Now compare that to the American system. The Federal Reserve has been talking about a digital dollar for years. Committees have been formed. Reports have been written. Concerns have been raised about privacy, about control, about government overreach. And while America debates, China builds. This is not a race where second place still wins. That's the off switch. Not a switch that turns the system off, a switch that turns American influence off, a switch that Beijing can flip whenever Washington tries to leverage the financial system as a weapon. Imagine this scenario. Taiwan, a crisis. The United States threatens sanctions. China responds by announcing that any nation participating in those sanctions will lose access to digital yuan settlement for trade with China. Suddenly, European nations face a choice: side with Washington and lose access to the world's largest consumer market, or maintain neutrality and keep their economic relationships intact. That leverage didn't exist 5 years ago. It exists now. Or consider this. The United States freezes Chinese assets held in dollars. Beijing responds by freezing dollar transactions through Chinese infrastructure. Suddenly, American companies operating in China can't repatriate profits. Supply chains seize. Markets panic. Who blinks first? These aren't hypothetical scenarios. They're planning exercises happening in both capitals right now. The $2 trillion day was a signal, a demonstration, a message to anyone paying attention that an alternative system is operational, tested, and ready to scale. Most Americans don't know this is happening. They see headlines about China's economy slowing, about real estate problems, about demographic challenges. All of those things are true. None of them change the fact that Beijing is building financial infrastructure that will outlast any single economic cycle. The infrastructure they've built isn't just about moving money. It's about creating dependencies. When a country adopts the digital yuan for trade, they integrate Chinese payment systems into their banks. They train their officials on Chinese financial protocols. They build relationships with Chinese institutions. Each connection makes the next connection easier. Each transaction makes the next transaction more likely. This is how empires are built in the modern age. Not through military conquest, through financial infrastructure that becomes too embedded to remove. Look at what happened with Huawei. Western nations tried to rip out Chinese telecommunications equipment after spending years installing it. The process was expensive, disruptive, and in many cases, incomplete. Now imagine trying to do that with an entire financial system, with payment rails that handle daily commerce, with settlement systems that underpin international trade. The switching costs become prohibitive. That's the lock-in China is building. Every nation that adopts the digital yuan becomes harder to extract from China's financial orbit. Every transaction that flows through Beijing instead of New York, is a transaction where America loses visibility, where American sanctions lose teeth, where American power diminishes. The dollar isn't collapsing. It's being bypassed. Transaction by transaction, trade agreement by trade agreement, central bank diversification decision by central bank diversification decision. And there's no emergency meeting that fixes this, no policy that reverses it, no speech that restores the old order, because the old order depended on there being no alternative. Once an alternative exists, once it proves it can handle real volume, once it gains adoption among nations that matter, the transition becomes inevitable. It's already happening. The question isn't whether it will continue. The question is how fast. Some analysts argue this is overblown. They point to the dollar's continued dominance in global reserves. They note that most international debt is still denominated in dollars. They observe that American capital markets remain the deepest and most liquid in the world. All of this is true. None of it contradicts the fundamental shift taking place. The pound remained the dominant reserve currency for decades after Britain's economic decline became obvious. Momentum is powerful in financial systems. Existing arrangements persist long after the conditions that created them have changed. But persistence is not permanence. The fact that the dollar remains dominant today doesn't mean it will remain dominant tomorrow. And the pace of change is accelerating. When the digital Yuan launched, transaction volumes were negligible. Within 4 years, they're processing trillions. That's not a linear progression. That's exponential growth. And exponential growth in financial systems creates tipping points, moments where the old equilibrium breaks and a new one establishes itself faster than anyone expected. The people who lose in this transition are the ones who assume the system that existed for the last 80 years will exist for the next 80. The institutions that assume dollar dominance is permanent. The investors who structure their portfolios around American financial hegemony lasting forever. The people who benefit are the ones building the new system, the early adopters. The nations positioning themselves as bridges between the dollar world and the Yuan world, the financial institutions that see the shift coming and adapt before they're forced to. But for most people, the shift will be invisible until it's complete. They'll wake up one day and notice that oil is priced in multiple currencies, that trade settlements happen through multiple systems, that the financial leverage America once held has been distributed among several powers, and they'll wonder when it happened. They'll look for the moment, the crisis, the announcement, but there won't be one. Because this kind of change doesn't happen in a day. It happens over years. In transactions nobody notices. In agreements that don't make headlines. In infrastructure deployments that seem technical and boring. Until suddenly they're not boring anymore. Until suddenly the world has changed. Until suddenly the system everyone took for granted is one option among several. The digital yuan isn't coming. It's here. It's processing trillions. It's settling trades. It's connecting economies that Washington once had the power to disconnect. And every transaction that flows through Beijing instead of New York is a transaction where American leverage decreases, where Chinese influence grows, where the balance of financial power shifts. This isn't theory. This isn't speculation about what the future holds. This is documentation of what's happening right now. While you're reading this, while analysts debate the likelihood of de-dollarization, while politicians argue about whether America needs a digital currency, the infrastructure is live. The volume is real. The alternative is operational. You won't see this shift in your bank account tomorrow. Your paycheck will still clear. Your credit card will still work. The gas station will still take dollars. But beneath that surface stability, the architecture of global power is being rewired. The system that gave America unilateral control over international finance is being replaced by a system where that control is contested, where leverage is distributed, where the ability to exclude nations from the global economy is no longer an American monopoly. China just moved $2 trillion in a day through a system America does not control and see ain't shut down. That's not a warning about what might happen. That's a record of what already did. And what already did is just the beginning of what comes next. The architecture of global finance is splitting. One system runs through New York and requires American approval. The other runs through Beijing and requires Chinese approval. And every day, more of the world is choosing to plug into both, hedging, diversifying, preparing for a reality where the dollar is an option, not a requirement. The benefits for China are obvious. They bypass sanctions. They reduce dependence on the dollar. They gain visibility into every transaction that flows through their system. They can incentivize use through favorable terms, through trade agreements, through infrastructure deals that lock nations into digital yuan adoption. But the benefits for other nations are real too. Faster settlement times, lower transaction costs, no exposure to dollar fluctuations, no risk of being cut off from the global financial system because Washington disapproves of your government. Saudi Arabia is a perfect example. For decades, the petrodollar agreement meant oil was priced in dollars. That arrangement gave the United States enormous leverage over global energy markets. But in 2023, Saudi Arabia began accepting yuan for oil sales to China. Not as a replacement for dollars, as an alternative, a backup, a hedge against a future where American financial dominance is no longer guaranteed. Russia took it further. After being cut off from SWIFT in 2022, Moscow had no choice but to build alternatives. The digital yuan became one of them. Trade between Russia and China now flows primarily through yuan-denominated channels. No dollars, no euros, no Western banks involved at all. Iran followed the same path. Venezuela, North Korea, nations that have been locked out of the dollar system didn't disappear. They adapted. And the digital yuan gave them the tool to do it. This is where the transfer happens, not from your bank account, not through inflation or taxation. The transfer is occurring at the level of structural power. The ability to decide who gets access to the global economy is moving from Washington to a multipolar system where Beijing holds veto power over an increasingly large share of transactions. And here's what makes this different from previous challenges to dollar dominance. The euro was supposed to be a competitor. It wasn't. The euro is still tied to Western financial infrastructure. It still requires SWIFT. It still operates within a system where American regulators have visibility and leverage. The digital yuan is architecture. It's pipes and rails and settlement systems that exist entirely outside Western control. You can't sanction what you can't see. You can't freeze assets you don't hold. You can't cut off access to a system you don't run. History shows us how these transitions happen. The British pound was the world's reserve currency for over a century. Its decline wasn't sudden. It was gradual. 2 world wars, economic exhaustion, the rise of a more powerful rival. By the time everyone acknowledged the dollar had replaced the pound, the transition was already complete. We are watching the same pattern unfold now, not as a crash, not as a single dramatic event, as a slow rebalancing. A steady migration of transactions away from a system where one nation holds unilateral control toward a system where power is distributed among rivals. The Federal Reserve's own data shows the trend. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 70% in 2000 to just under 60% today. That might not sound dramatic, but in the context of global finance, it's a landslide, and it's accelerating. Central banks around the world are diversifying their holdings. They're buying gold, they're holding more euros, they're accumulating yuan, not because they trust Beijing more than Washington, because they trust the concentration of power less than they trust diversification. This is rational behavior. If you're a central bank in a mid-sized economy, you've watched what happened to Russia. You've watched assets frozen. You've watched sanctions deployed as first resort tools of foreign policy. And you've realized that holding all your reserves in a system controlled by a single foreign power is a vulnerability. The digital yuan offers an exit, not a complete exit, not a replacement, but an alternative. A way to conduct trade, settle payments, and hold reserves without total dependence on American goodwill. And once that alternative exists, the network effects that made the dollar dominant start working in reverse. The more nations adopt the digital yuan, the more valuable it becomes as a medium of exchange. The more valuable it becomes, the more nations adopt it. The cycle feeds itself. China understands this. They're not trying to replace the dollar overnight. They're building parallel infrastructure. They're offering better terms to early adopters. They're tying digital yuan adoption to Belt and Road investments, to trade agreements, to diplomatic relationships. They're patient. They're strategic. They're playing a long game. And the United States is responding with the tools it has. Sanctions, restrictions on technology exports, diplomatic pressure. But these tools are less effective against an adversary that has spent 2 decades building self-sufficiency. China doesn't need American semiconductors to run its digital currency. They don't need Western banks to clear transactions. They don't need permission.